Hello and good morning, everyone, and welcome to your morning briefing for Thursday, the 26th of June, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shelby, and let's go ahead and jump inside the Beltway here, starting our domestic sitrep. Good morning, Robert. So, the Trump administration is targeting three Mexican finance firms. I guess this is stemming from increased cooperation between the Treasury and probably FinCEN and some of these Mexican banks trying to root out cartel money.
Well, it looks like the Trump administration is explicitly targeting these three firms due to cartel money. And this is actually the first use of new sanction authorities under the Fentanyl Sanctions Act and the Fentanyl Act. And the three firms that FinCEN are targeting are CEI Banco SA, Intercom Banco SA, and Vector Casa de Bolsa SA. And what's interesting about who they're targeting is that Vector is actually owned by a multimillionaire who was who's AMLO's former chief of staff, and the current Mexico finance minister actually worked at that bank. And yeah, this is the first step in the Trump administration going after the cartel financing. And they specifically called these three banks out as what they called primary money laundering concerns.
Mm-hmm. By the way, FinCEN, we mentioned that. We didn't say exactly what it was. If you're not familiar, that is the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network that is within the Treasury Department. You know, Robert, this is one thing that we've continually talked about. Really, this came to the forefront when Dan Crenshaw and other people were talking about the potential use of U.S. military in Mexico to go after the cartels. The Mexican government is obviously extremely against that. However, I did point out all these things that Mexico is doing. Big pat on the back. Operation Northern Border. They're going in and destroying drug labs and arresting thousands of. I think they have arrested something like 4,000 criminals. Most of them probably are cartel since the Trump administration began. So big pat on the back there. But these cartel links, like you said, they go directly back to AMLO and the people who surround him, and the Morena Party, which is the leftist party in charge in Mexico, of which the current president, Claudia Sheinbaum, is also a part. So great points there. And I would say overall good news. We'll see how things continue to happen there. All right, let's move on to President Trump saying that U.S. allies can't rely on adversaries for minerals. Seems kind of like a no-brainer, but what did he say?
This was from a talk yesterday at the NATO conference. It's ongoing. And President Trump said that the U.S. and allies can't rely on foreign adversaries for critical minerals and critical defense industry inputs. And the Ukraine war has underscored the necessity of shoring up these mineral supply chains and rebuilding domestic defense industry. I think this sounds obvious to most people, but to me, this stands out because Trump said something similar about Russian energy during his first term to NATO partners, and they basically laughed it off.
I think they're laughed.
Yeah, I think they are taking this much more seriously now, especially as we've seen the EU countries and NATO partners start pushing for more greater bolstering of their own defense industries.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. All right, let's move on. Bipartisan bill to ban agencies from buying adversary AI. Now, this is just for the use within the U.S. government.
Correct. Yeah, it's called the No Adversarial AI Act, and it will block the federal government from purchasing or using any AI products that are made by companies with ties to foreign adversaries. This seems like this is the obvious problem here is that these contractors selling AI products, they're obviously not advertising any links they have to the Chinese Communist Party. So it's difficult for these agencies to discern where these links are. However, we have, as I think we covered over the last month or so, it's become much more clear that some of these electronic certification labs, have major ties to the Chinese Communist Party, and they are certifying not just the, potentially software or AI products, but also hardware that the U.S. government is buying.
Mm-hmm. And so just the big risk here is that China gets their hands on sensitive government data when the government starts using these AI systems.
Correct.
Okay. All right. Thanks. And listen, I'll let you just go on and finish up the domestic sit rep here.
Well, yesterday, OMB Director, Office of Management and Budget Director Russell Vought said that President Trump could attempt what's called a pocket rescission to cut spending if this $9.4 billion rescission bill doesn't make it through Congress. And Vought said that the Impoundment Control Act would allow Trump to block federal spending without congressional approval if he asked for a rescission bill fewer than 45 days before the end of the year, because under that act, if Congress does not act on that request within 45 days, it's automatically passed. And then ICE confirmed after that at least 70 illegal aliens that were detained at a worksite raid at Glen Valley Foods in Omaha, Nebraska last week used stolen Social Security numbers and identification to obtain employment, which highlights why at least the current iteration of E-Verify does not work, because these were not illegal aliens, employed at this food processing plant, knowingly, or at least on the surface, knowingly known by the employers. But I think it's unlikely that employers, especially in the agriculture industry and food processing, are completely unaware that there's this massive level of identity fraud going on in order for these illegal immigrants to basically get through E-Verify. And the Department of Justice announced a lawsuit yesterday, and they're suing the Orange County, California Register of Voters. And they said that the register refused to provide the DOJ with any evidence that they removed non-citizens from their voter rolls. And DOJ said that they're filing this lawsuit under the Help America Vote Act because they're saying that this California officials has failed to maintain accurate voter rolls.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. And let's go ahead and move on to the global sitrep here, starting with Trende Aragua. Go ahead, Jared.
Indeed. So on Tuesday, the State Department sanctioned Giovanni Vicente Mascara Serrano. He's a major narcotics trafficker, extortionist, and finance manager, for Trende Aragua. He actually does control a fair bit of their money. And mostly he's overseeing these operations, not conducting them himself. He's also overseen several murders, according to the State Department. And the FBI added him to their top 10 most wanted list. At the same time, the Department of Justice indicted him on terrorism charges. All of this is obviously meant to effectively try to decapitate Trende Aragua.
Where is this guy? Is he in Venezuela?
They have a $3 million bounty for any information that leads to his arrest. So I think they're trying to figure that out.
Mm-hmm.
But as soon as if they arrest him and publish it, I will follow up on that.
Thanks.
Moving over to the Middle East, the Iran's parliament voted yesterday to suspend all cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency in order to halt surveillance and reporting activities by the IAEA inside of Iran. But the parliament also voted not to leave the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So Iran, the reason Iran's doing this is they're linking the suspension directly to the U.S. attack on their nuclear facilities, and suggested that the IAEA had provided information to the U.S. and Israel, which prior to Israel's strikes, they were suggesting something similar. They said that IAEA had revealed who their nuclear scientists were, leading to assassinations. This is not the first time they've done this, but this does actually notably Russia backed Iran up on this, saying, yes, we get why you would do this. I think that portends very poorly for nuclear proliferation in the future. Mm-hmm. Staying on the topic of Iran, in an interview yesterday with Politico, Secretary of State Marco Rubio clarified President Trump's statement about regime change in Iran. That got a lot of press recently after he suggested, well, if you don't make Iran great again, maybe regime change is in the cards. What Rubio said was that if Iran, quote, wants to keep spending money on terrorism, keep spending money on trying to get nuclear weapons, keep spending money on rockets to attack Israel, and not develop their economy or help their people, maybe there will be a regime change because the people of Iran are going to get sick of it. The interviewer asked him to clarify about where that would come from, and Rubio added that the change will come from within Iran and the U.S. will not be involved in it.
We'll see. It's obvious Israel is pushing for regime change in Iran. I covered that on yesterday's show on the In Focus section. All right, Jared, please continue to the G7.
Yep. Still with Marco Rubio here, big player. So he met with the G7 foreign ministers on the sidelines of the NATO summit. And just as a quick side note, I think that's because he didn't get to do so at the actual G7 summit. Now, there, all of these foreign ministers agreed to deepen cooperation on China's, quote, destabilizing actions in the South China Sea and maintain a free and open Indo-Pacific. Longtime viewers will be familiar with that phrase, but the free and open Indo-Pacific is a key phrase for foreign policy that requires combating China's rise. This was actually coined by Shinzo Abe, not the United States, but it was picked up and proliferated by the U.S. under the first Trump administration. Now, this agreement is an attempt to expand the core anti-China coalition by directly involving the European powers and the European Union, because the major European powers and the EU all attend the G7 summit. Mm-hmm. Then moving over to the South China Sea, the Philippines and the U.S. are going to fire the HIMARS rocket system in about 4 days. And this will be one of the first live fire exercises they've done, but it's going to be in conjunction with several Apache helicopters as part of the Salaknib exercises that go on pretty much as an immediate follow-on to Balikatan every year. Now, I do have to wonder here, is the U.S. is constantly giving the newest possible weapon systems to the Philippines, trying to integrate them, getting all these manufacturing plants. It looks to me like the U.S. is trying to fully integrate the armed force of the Philippines into it as basically a subservient force for the Philippines and its local area.
Mm-hmm. So could we I believe we have a cooperation agreement, something like that with South Korea, where you have a joint command. Could we see something like that develop in the Philippines, a U.S. and Philippines joint command?
I don't think it would even be that soft. It really looks to me like the Philippines will just report to the United States. Just how thoroughly they're integrating with everything, they're going to either report to the United States or Japan itself.
Mm-hmm. All right. Interesting. Thanks for that, Jared. Let's go ahead and move on to today's In Focus, which is Civil War Comes to the West. So first of all, a handful of early warning subscribers sent me a link to this article. It's by David Betts. It's a fantastic essay. It is entitled Civil War Comes to the West. And Betts is a professor of war at King's College London. He concludes, I think rightly, that the greatest threat to Western countries is not external, but it is internal. And this means, he says, civil war is coming to Western countries. By the way, I provide that a link in this morning's report. It's worth a read. I'm going to hit the high points here and just briefly talk about the major points. Civil wars and domestic conflicts, he writes, are growing more likely for a number of reasons. Number one is fractured societies, which really we're talking about cultural disintegration, predominantly in these Western countries that have had mass immigration. But we're also seeing lack, or I would say deterioration, of social cohesion. And one of the things that Randall Collins said is that, and this, I think he was actually quoted by Peter Turchin. He said, cultural uniformity appears to be a precondition of social cohesion, which is to say, when you have a country that no longer has cultural uniformity, you no longer have that precondition for social cohesion. And when cohesion deteriorates, you get societal disintegration. And this is one of those kind of bedrock conditions, I think, that makes domestic conflicts far more likely. At any rate, Betts continues, it's not just fractured society, it's also economic stagnation, elite overreach, collapse in public confidence in institutions, and the belief that that normal politics can solve these very deep issues that these countries are facing. And then finally, he also says it's the realization by anti-status quo groups that these systems can be disrupted by attacking critical infrastructure. And he talks about some cases where that is already happening. He says the risk is the greatest for Britain and France. And he also mentions the United States and probably 10 other Western European countries in here. And again, it's because these countries are experiencing mass immigration and they're feeling the fruits of that, or the consequences of that, which are not just political, they're social, they're economic, psychological, just very deep systemic level problems. The most shocking part of this is that he cites current literature estimates that say when you have a number of countries that have risk factors for civil war or for some sort of violent domestic conflict. And he says when these risk factors are present in a country, there's about a 4% annualized chance of civil conflict breaking out. And Betts does some kind of back of the napkin math here, and he says if any individual country has a 4% chance per year, that's 18.5% over 5 years. So we're talking about a growing likelihood over 5 years. But the biggest point that he makes is you have these 15 countries that have these risk factors that they all have that 4% chance per year, or 18.5% chance over 5 years. But when you take those 15 countries collectively over the course of 5 years, the chance that a civil war breaks out in any of those 15 countries rises to maybe up to 95% over the course of 5 years. So it looks like to me, he's saying it's a near certainty that one of these countries will experience the outbreak of violent domestic conflict. As a result, they're waiting for a trigger event. He also says once a civil war starts in one of these Western countries, because there's so many other countries dealing with the same problems, he says there's a 60% chance, at least a 60% chance of additional conflict spreading to these other countries over 5 years. I think the likelihood is far higher than that, because once a precedent has been set, it's just like these riots in LA that we saw earlier this month. All of a sudden you had other cities with very similar conditions and similar types of groups and similar federal enforcement operations and similar grievances, and you get a similar result, and you get riots spreading to other cities. So I can easily see if a civil war, some kind of violent domestic conflict were to outbreak in Ireland or Britain or France, I think it will spread. I think there's a far higher chance than 60%. But his message to governments here is that the risk is real. His message to citizens in these countries is that they're not crazy for fearing these types of possibilities. And his message to military commanders in the defense establishment is that they need to start reorienting to this reality. The reality for many military commanders is they're focused on international level warfare, when historically civil wars are far more common. Betts also describes 3 characteristics. He says, look, these civil wars, they're unique because every country is unique, and so there's different, very unique circumstances. But he says all of these types of conflicts have 3 things in common. Number one, he says serious depredation of societal cultural infrastructure. So he's talking about historic objects and art and museums being looted, those types of things. The next is destruction of human capital and internal displacement, which I'll talk about in just a second. And then finally here, he talks about briefly the risk of foreign predation and intervention. From 1945 to 1999, the median length of a civil war was 6 years. And he cites some information that shows foreign involvement, when you have external support, when you have a foreign country providing support to one side in a civil war, it tends to lengthen the conflict. And just kind of by extrapolation, it also causes higher death tolls. The longer these civil wars go on, the higher the death toll. And by the way, the death toll, literature and the research is very clear. Most of these deaths are civilian in a civil war. One problem that Betts cites specifically is he says Western governments are, quote, losing their ability to peacefully manage multicultural societies. And he goes on, he talks about what he calls feral cities. And he says large cities in these countries are turning feral and they're getting worse. And one of the responses, or one of the reactions in the future could be, or maybe he says will be, people in the rural areas, because we have this urban-rural divide. We've seen it here in this country. It's very clear. And you start to look at the critical infrastructure that runs into those cities, talking about highways and transportation, water, food, all this stuff comes from outside the city. And he says there's a realization that's been happening that if you want to strike out against the system and you want to attack the epicenter of this system, which tends to be these large urban areas where the people who are making these decisions tend to live, he said the risk is very high that critical infrastructure gets targeted by people in the rural areas in order to cause collapse or to strike out against the people in these urban areas. And when you look at critical infrastructure, I mean, we just look at power lines, we can look at pipelines, all sorts of things. It's unguarded. It's extremely vulnerable. And his conclusion is that this could lead or will lead ultimately to some form of urban collapse when this starts to happen. When this happens, you're going to see migration, first by the people who have the means and enough sense to leave, and then later by refugees. Displacement can happen very rapidly, and refugees impose a massive humanitarian challenge and other risks, especially to outlying areas. And so one of the things he says is government should work to build these kind of strategic areas. He calls them, I think, secure zones, and try to keep daily life as normal as possible. And that means probably controlling access and keeping disruption to a minimum there. By the way, this is not just something that David Betts says. That's a pretty clear strategy for counterinsurgency as well. Like if you look at Afghanistan and Iraq especially, what did U.S. forces do? We came in there, we T-walled off entire sections of Baghdad to try to keep the insurgents out. And it just so happens that these massive population centers are where most of the voters are. And of course, we're trying to export democracy to Iraq and Afghanistan. But here domestically, the big takeaway is whoever controls the voters in the cities are going to win the elections. And so I just kind of looking here at a second, third order effect. If something like this were to happen, I think that would be a huge risk for people living in rural areas. I mean, it's already happening without these cities being T-walled off, but a T-wall is just like a 10 or 12 foot high concrete barrier. And you use them for basically access control. You are able to control who's coming in or out of a city. At any rate, one of the conclusions that Betts makes is that defense establishments, and again, he's writing in a military strategy journal, and so his audience are, I would imagine, predominantly military. But one of the things he says is that these defense establishments need to guard against normalcy bias, and it can never happen here thinking. He does cite some literature that these civil wars or domestic armed conflicts are obviously more common and more deadly than interstate wars, although these interstate wars get most of the focus from military planners. He ends this essay by saying at least one Civil War researcher is finding that civil wars are becoming, they're declining by volume, but he also says they're becoming, quote, far less ordered and conventional, which is to say a lot more messy. Just my takeaway here. Well, this is going to come in two parts. I'm going to cover the rest in this in focus, and then tomorrow I'll come back through and answer some more questions, just for the sake of time and space. I founded Fort Observer back in 2016 as an intelligence company because I saw the need for actionable intelligence at that time, which was on these various far left groups, the violent far left groups, the revolutionary left. That's really where I started this, tracking these groups day to day. And after seeing Antifa violence in 2015, and then that turned into anti-Trump violence starting in 2016, it was very clear to me that our country had entered into a period of low-intensity conflict. What we're talking about so far, and there's this image on your screen here, what we're talking about so far in the United States is called low-intensity conflict, and that is an umbrella term. Before we get to that, low-intensity conflict is a war. It is a form of warfare. It's probably more popularly referred to as irregular warfare today. But we're talking about violence beneath the threshold of conventional war, Okay, so we're beneath conventional. We're not talking about tanks and bombers. This is not like Russia, Ukraine, or World War II. Those are high intensity conflicts. So beneath the threshold of conventional war, but above routine peaceful competition. This is not simple political competition. The United States is not at war with each other, at least not yet. We're definitely not at peace with each other. And so we have this gray area, and that is where we are. And that's where we'll continue to be. So this takes the form of many types of conflicts. At the low level, we're talking about protest movements and violent social movements like BLM, for instance. That is a form of low intensity conflict, the riots that we saw. And then moving up, we're talking about terrorism, talking about armed guerrilla conflicts, we're talking about gray zone warfare, popular revolutions to include color revolutions. That is a form of low intensity conflict or irregular warfare. And then all the way up to and including insurgency and counterinsurgency. The United States, either domestically or abroad, we have seen most of these forms of warfare over the past 20 years, which is to say that no one watching this is a stranger to these types of conflicts. We know very well what they look like because we've seen many of these happen here at home. So my baseline expectation is that we will remain in this period of lesser or greater low intensity conflict through at least the end of this decade. Now, whether this turns into a civil war, a quote unquote civil war, I think can be debated. One of the reasons why I rarely use the term civil war, even though I talk about this type of stuff frequently, is because it's very vague and it conjures up a lot of different opinions and a lot of different ideas and pictures in the imagination of people that vary and very, very widely. So typically when we're talking about civil war, we are talking about an armed conflict that meets 4 criteria. And the first thing is that the government is involved as a belligerent. The government has to be involved as a belligerent. Otherwise, you get 2 gangs fighting each other. Okay, that's obviously not a civil war. So a government has to be involved as the belligerent. The second thing is that the military has to be involved as a belligerent, which is to say that this is not a police action. When the military gets deployed and the military takes part in the fighting, that's when you have a civil war on your hands. Otherwise, we're just dealing with low intensity conflict. And typically when we're talking about, again, civil wars can take different types of conflicts, could be civil wars, but these are the 4 things that we're looking at when we officially declare that something is a civil war. The third thing is that there has to be fighting on both sides, which is to say that this cannot be a genocide. So there has to be fighting by at least 2 sides, these 2 belligerents here in a single country. And finally, and this is kind of the more tenuous position, but typically a civil war is a mass casualty producing event. And so just in terms of textbook definition, we're looking at 1,000 combat-related deaths in a calendar year. And again, this is kind of the most tenuous position. It seems kind of arbitrary to me, 1,000. So you're telling me that if a domestic conflict has 900 deaths in a calendar year, it's not a civil war? Obviously, there's some gray area there. But the underlying principle here is that a civil war produces a massive death toll. And most of those, we know from studying civil wars, most of those are, it's almost always civilians that have a larger death toll than the actual belligerents. So regardless of the exact number, the point is we're talking about combat-related deaths. So nothing that we have seen so far, obviously, in this country in the past 20 years is a civil war, although it is low-intensity conflict, violent social movements, terrorism, low-intensity conflict. So the question is, will the United States experience a civil war before the year 2030? And again, Professor David Betts does some math, and he appears to believe that, if you say something's a 95% likelihood over the course of 5 years, that's a near certainty. So to answer that, I would break this up into maybe 3 subcomponents or 3 other questions. Number 1, is it possible or feasible? Is a civil war by 2030 in this country possible? Next is if it is possible, then what is the likelihood? Because something can be possible, but extremely unlikely. And then lastly, what form will it take, or what will it actually look like? So I think, yes, a civil war before 2030 is obviously possible, mainly because we have a big election year coming up in 2028. And typically, well, we'll save that for later. Right now, and on any given day, the likelihood of a civil war breaking out is obviously extremely low. By 2030, however, I can see at least 3 events that could happen that I think could lead to organized political violence, which is to say coordinated, deliberate, armed political violence. We're not talking about mob violence. We're not talking about opportunistic violence. We're talking about organized murder, team sports. Okay. This is coordinated, deliberate, organized, conducted by groups of people in this country. So under the right conditions, the likelihood, again, is extremely low now, but it could grow very rapidly under the right conditions. Lastly, we have to describe what this conflict will look like. And I think that is heavily dependent on the conditions that are exhibited at the time and the underlying causes, or what is the trigger event. And this is a huge topic. I'm going to go into it tomorrow in the info focus section. So if you get our report, I'll break this down long form for you, and we'll talk about it on tomorrow's show. I just want to end with this last point here, which is, again, I started Ford Observer back in 2016 because I was just looking at the level of political violence, and I said, this is not going to end anytime soon. And people actually need to understand what these groups are doing. Like in 2020 especially, it was a need to know on a day-to-day basis. So that need for timely and accurate intelligence is going to remain a high need through at least the end of this decade, due to this risk of domestic conflict in the United States. So I appreciate you supporting our mission and what we do here. This is really the bread and butter of what Ford Observer was started as. And I would be extremely surprised if we don't get back to that very soon in the coming years. With that, let's go ahead and move on to protests today. We are tracking 65 protests, which is about baseline. It has been elevated over the past several weeks. All right, let's go ahead and jump into a few other items here. Robert, welcome back to the show. Let's talk about this judge. He's an Obama-appointed judge, and he ruled against the Trump administration that, I guess back in March, President Trump signed an executive order that banned thousands of federal employees from collective bargaining. This judge came out and said, nope, that's illegal. You can't do that. Why does it matter?
Well, there's been this push, as we've covered for a while now, from Sean Fain, the UAW president, to get this 2028 May Day general strike going. And, while the court precedent right now is that these federal agencies, these unionized employees cannot strike, I think, depending on what happens over the next 3.5 years, we could see the anti-Trump federal employees say they do not care if the legal precedent is on their side if they decide to join this general strike in 2028. And I think based on how these lower level district courts have been ruling against the Trump administration, maybe they get some legal cover from the district courts until the Supreme Court's able to take up a Trump administration challenge to that strike.
Mm-hmm. And again, that's coming up May 1st, 2028. And it's not just UAW. It's one of the things that Sean Fain was trying to do is encourage unions to renegotiate their contract expiration dates for May 1st so that they could launch into a strike on May Day. And again, we're talking about International Workers' Day, May Day, which is the socialist Labor Day. And so this goes back, for me at least, this goes back to low intensity conflict here. This is a form of conflict. And Robert, any other points you'd like to make before we move on?
No.
Okay. All right. Thanks for that. Let's move on here to this next item. This is interesting. There's a Republican-backed bill in the House, and they are proposing to move Mexico from the Northern Command, or the NORTHCOM AOR, Area of Responsibility, which you can see there on your screen. Move it from NORTHCOM to SOUTHCOM, which is the Southern Command. And NORTHCOM, again, just as a reminder, is tasked with the defense of North America. That image on your screen there should reflect that Greenland is now a part of NORTHCOM. So if Mexico were to be moved, just in terms of who's responsible for that area, it would not be the first this year. The bill sponsors say that Southcom is much better aligned to deal with the similar challenges that Mexico has, because they're very similar to those in Central and South America as well, which is the Southcom AOR there. And I think there is some merit here. This may be a mistake. Maybe Republicans should not be doing this, but just for the sake of argument. Earlier this year, NORTHCOM did expand its AOR to incorporate Greenland, which is a massive expanse of land. And now we're getting to an ISR challenge, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. So you only have so many intelligence collection assets available to you as a combatant commander or as any other unit. And so we're talking about a huge, absolutely huge area. When we look at Mexico, we're really talking about the southern border. It's not just Mexican issues, but Mexican issues affect our border security, which affects our national security. Last year, we heard from the outgoing Southcom commander, General Laura Richardson. She told members of Congress that Southcom has about 1% of all available ISR assets. So while Mexico does have security problems that are more closely aligned with Central and South America, this border region would have to remain a NORTHCOM priority, because we are talking about the defense of North America here, and Mexico is in North America. So I would say, even if Mexico were moved to Southcom, if that did not come with additional ISR assets for Southcom, I think it would be an absolute nightmare. Republicans are going to figure this out in Congress, and I just want to let everyone know that Republicans are pushing this. And again, AOR does stand for Area of Responsibility. Thanks for that in the chat. Something to consider as we move along. All right, next item, Jared. All right, so we earlier this week we did hear that some FBI agents. Let's back up, Robert, a couple months. FBI special agents were previously mandated that they had to spend a certain part of their time working on immigration enforcement issues. And after this Iran thing started popping off, they took the counterintelligence and counterterrorism FBI special agents and said, this doesn't apply to you. You stay on your missions on Iran. What else do we need to know to fill in the gaps?
So yesterday at a congressional hearing, the Assistant Director, Jose Perez, he's the Assistant Director of the Criminal Investigation Division, during this hearing, he did say something interesting, is that the FBI is now better positioned than ever to address the threat of what he called potential foreign-backed threats in the U.S. after working hand-in-hand on immigration with DHS and ICE. And I did see that ICE earlier this week announced the arrest of 11 Iranian nationals in the U.S. illegally within the first 48 hours of the week. But I think this, combined with comments from FBI Director Kash Patel, which he did say this earlier this week at the Sheriff's Association conference here in Florida, that the scramble to surveil and detain these potential Iranian sleeper cells, I think, is evidence that Biden's Department of Homeland Security and the FBI were not releasing these special interest aliens in order to conduct further surveillance and find potential threat networks. Because as soon as those strikes happened and it came out that Iran had sent that communique to Trump while he was at the G7 meeting, there seemed to be this immediate scramble to try to find and potentially subvert and detain these networks.
Mm-hmm. Robert, I remember talking about this with you just a couple of years ago. Best case scenario, these special interest aliens were being encountered at the border and released into the United States again. Best case scenario, I didn't say that I believe this, but best case scenario was that they would be surveilled by law enforcement like FBI, counterintelligence, or counterterrorism surveillance teams to map out the network, see who they're meeting with, and try to get a better picture of what these people are trying to do inside the United States. You're saying best case scenario was did not happen, correct?
Yeah, I think this is evidence that that was not true. There's other points that we've covered over the last couple of years, including that DHS whistleblower who said that the Biden administration was, without any further screening or scrutiny, just releasing these special interest aliens into the interior. And I think the relatively low number that I was able to actually find confirmed for how many of these Iranian nationals have been picked up by ICE so far is barely a fraction of the 1,200 plus that Tom Homan has said that the Biden administration released into the U.S.
Mm-hmm. What DHS is saying they've now arrested over 100, I think was the number.
I saw someone claim that they heard from a source that it was 170 or 130 over the last 7 days, and they had a total of 670 Iranian nationals in custody. ICE saying that, but I couldn't find any confirmation from ICE. The only number I could find that ICE has put out is 11 over 48 hours at the beginning of this week.
So best case scenario, DHS and ICE have 600 out of 1,200 plus in custody.
Correct.
All right. You know, I keep seeing this on Twitter, and it's a very good point. Who's going to jail for this? I mean, I would guess, just venture to guess, that no one is going to jail for this, unfortunately. But, I mean, this is really, we're talking about just absolute treason against this country at the highest levels. And I hate to editorialize, but, you know, Robert, it's just tough. We talk about this kind of stuff so often. It's like, who is going to pay for what they've done to this country? And I don't see anyone so far.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't. I think former DHS Secretary Mayorkas is probably the most publicly, available person to be investigated and potentially, charged over these actions, and I don't think that's going to happen.
All right. Thanks for that, Robert. Let's move on here. Let's talk about, guys, one of the things that I talked about in the InFocus is there's at least 3 scenarios that I can see developing that would ultimately lead to organized political violence or a civil war, like an actual civil war happening in this country. From time to time, I talk to this, he's a former hedge fund guy, and we talk about all sorts of stuff, mainly about markets and the economy. And he's based in Europe. And so he has I think his ear's pretty close to the ground on these kind of European globalists, the WEF type of folks. And he has encouraged me in no uncertain terms to leave the United States. He's like, Mike, you got to get out. It's not anytime soon, but there is coming a point in the United States where it will be very difficult to leave. And again, this guy's ran a multi-billion-dollar hedge fund, and so he's not an idiot. And one of our conversations is what happens in the United States, inside it, when people wake up and realize that their bank is not only insolvent, because I believe a great many banks actually are technically insolvent. When you look at unrealized losses on treasury bonds that they bought back in 2020 or 2021 that have declined in value. I think Bank of America is sitting on something like $400 billion, or it's at least $100 billion of unrealized losses. This is something that Nouriel Roubini has also talked about. Nouriel Roubini went to the World Economic Forum and warned them back in 2006 about what would become the great financial crisis. And he said people actually laughed at him. But one of the things that he has said is that a majority of U.S. banks are actually underwater. They're insolvent. They do not have asset valuations to cover all their liabilities. And again, this is mainly due to these treasury bonds. At any rate, let's keep that in the back of our mind, because when people wake up and realize that there's been a bail-in at their bank, if these insolvent banks do end up going under, there will be a bail-in, probably not a bailout. And a bail-in means the bank owns the money that's deposited at that bank. At that point, it's no longer yours. Your money gets taken by that bank to pay their creditors. And this is something that's just happened probably over the past 2 or 3, or maybe a few more years than that. But go back and read the fine print in your banking agreements and look for those bail-in provisions, because in many cases they will be there. If you're at a credit union, that may be different. But if you're at a big bank, they will be bailed in. They will just simply, if there's a solvency issue, they will take the deposits from the depositors in order to pay their creditors. We know this is a 100% fact. With that in mind, what happens to Americans when they wake up and realize that this has happened, that their insolvent pension funds are no longer there, no longer paying out their bank accounts, their retirement accounts, whatever. I mean, it's going to be a very, very messy, difficult situation in this country. And that's one of those things where I could actually see that eventually leading, because when everything has been taken from you, the barrier to your getting involved in an armed conflict it comes down substantially. At any rate, let's talk about these SLRs. So there's a thing called a supplementary leverage ratio. It's an SLR. And the Fed has been toying with this for a while here, talking about making changes to the SLR. The Federal Reserve yesterday announced that they are going to finally consider updates to this supplementary leverage ratio, which requires banks to hold a minimum level of capital relative to their leverage exposure. So the more leverage a bank has, the more cash that they need to keep on hand as a part of this SLR program. The SLR was implemented after the 2008 financial crisis to prevent banks from becoming over-leveraged. And the Fed did this by enforcing minimum capital requirements. So again, forcing banks to hold a certain amount of cash in reserve relative to the risk of their leverage. The Fed is getting ready to probably reduce or maybe eliminate some parts of this SLR. In theory, reducing these minimum capital requirements is going to lead to greater leverage, which could grow to impose a systemic risk to the financial system, which is exactly what we saw in 2008. This is not a near-term concern of mine, a long-term, obviously. It is at least possible, and it may be very likely, that this SLR is only going to be changed in order to exempt Treasury bond holdings. And this is going to allow banks to hold more Treasury bonds without having to worry about minimum capital requirements. If you're a bank, you want your money working for you. You don't want minimum capital requirements. You want your capital returning. You want to return on your capital. At any rate, the more important consideration here is that we have seen weak international demand for Treasuries. We've seen a lot of capital rotate out of Treasuries. That's why yields have been rising. And if you're the Treasury Department, you don't want higher yields. You want lower yields because that reduces the cost of government borrowing. And so if you're the Fed and you're the Treasury, you look at this and say, well, one feasible way that we can get lower yields is to allow banks to buy more government bonds. And that is the aim of this SLR rule change. Now, we have talked about this many times before. I've talked about this book by Ray Dalio, his latest book called How Countries Go Broke. And in it, he describes what he calls a debt spiral. And that is effectively where a country has to borrow money just to pay the interest on the national debt. You're borrowing money to pay the interest on borrowed money. That's the debt spiral. The U.S. debt to GDP ratio is about 124%. 130% is widely considered as the point of no return. I can only think of one case where a country has had a higher debt to GDP ratio and has not experienced this debt spiral. But we're at 124 now. We will almost certainly surpass that within a number of years. We'll be above 130. Historically, surpassing that 130% threshold induces a death spiral from which no country recovers. And one of the countries that this has not happened to yet is Japan. Japan has about a 265% debt to GDP ratio. And the only reason why they have not experienced that yet is because they've adopted some very extreme measures called financial repression. And one of those things is yield curve control. And they basically just cap yields on the debt. We will undoubtedly see that in the United States eventually. But crossing this 130% threshold would indicate that we will see more extreme financial and monetary measures that we call art is called financial repression. So I look at this SLR here, this this rule change that's going to enable banks to buy more treasuries without regard to minimum capital requirements. This is a type of, I think, market distortion that precedes financial repression. This is something that they can do through a rule change that is not as extreme as something like financial repression. And that, again, includes yield curve control, where the Treasury will come in and they say, we want to keep yields on 30-year bonds low. Let's say we cap them at 5%. So all the Treasury will do, they'll just tell people, if yields go above 5%, the Fed's going to come in and monetize the debt. They're going to come in and buy these 30-year Treasuries in enough volume to where they push yields below 5%. So in other words, it's going to keep people buying yields below 5%, because if the value of those bonds go down, then they know the Fed's going to step in and buy up the bonds and push the bond values up. So that's essentially what yield curve control is. But we're also talking about things like capping interest rates, implementing capital controls that prevent people from moving their money out of the country. Lots of countries already do this, implement capital controls. When you go to the airport and there's a dog there that's sniffing currency, or when you fly out of the United States to a foreign country and you see a dog there sniffing, it could be a bomb dog. There are also dogs that sniff out cash, and they're trying to prevent people from bringing, I think it's more than $10,000 or something like that, without declaring it. They're trying to keep people from moving their money out of the country. That's called capital controls. Eventually, you are not going to be able to wire your money out of this country. And this is one of the things that my hedge fund friend is trying to get across. Eventually, it's going to be very difficult to move funds or make independent financial decisions without running afoul of some new regulation or some new control that the Fed or the Treasury is putting on your money. And again, Ray Dalio talks about this in his latest book, How Countries Go Broke. He estimates in that book there's an 80% chance of a debt spiral and a U.S. sovereign debt crisis in the next 10 years. 80% chance over 10 years. So the bottom line here is that relaxing these SLR standards is a first step towards a canary in the coal mine. This is something they can do easily before they are forced into more difficult measures in the future. Guys, it will happen. There is no, other than Japan, there is no case. Actually, and even in Japan, they've had to resort to financial pressure. There is repression. There is no country in the world that has gotten this bad in terms of their debt to GDP ratio that have not been forced into extreme measures like this. It is coming. It is a matter of time. SLR is just, again, something they can do easily before they have to do something more difficult. With that, let's go ahead and move on to the next item. All right, Robert, go ahead. California Governor Gavin Newsom warned that these farms are just pumping so much water out of the ground, and big cities like LA are taking water from so many surrounding areas, they're running into a major problem.
Yeah, and so Gavin Newsom, he said that basically their groundwater infrastructure is not prepared for the future where California is going to be more arid and drier. There was a report released by the California Department of Water Resources earlier this week, and they did show that California groundwater levels stabilized over the last year, but further in the report, it is actually groundwater levels have actually dropped by 49% over the last 2 decades. So in the long term, I think Western states are headed toward a significant water security issue, especially states that get water from the Colorado River Basin. And this is due to, I think, growing urban populations who demand more water, especially in desert areas. In Nevada is one big area that has grown a lot. A lot of water-intensive industry that is coming into the region, like semiconductor plants in Arizona, which are heavily dependent on very pure water, and then industrial agriculture practices that are depleting these aquifers. Like one that we covered a few years ago is the Oglala Aquifer, which is heavily used by U.S. agriculture and is being depleted. And they're talking something like catastrophic levels within the next 10 years of water use. Something that Newsom, I found, has been pushing is the approval of this project called the Delta Conveyance Project, which is effectively a plan to pump water from the north part of the state that is agriculture heavy and also politically Republican toward the southern half of the state, which leans much more Democrat, is much larger urban areas like LA and San Francisco. And I think as this water security issue becomes less stable in the long run, over the next decade, we could start to see some of these state governments like California prioritize urban areas that tend to vote for them, as you mentioned earlier in the show, over these Republican rural areas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great point. I'm reminded of that real estate guy that's buying up a ton of land in the Midwest, especially in Ohio. And listen, maybe California figures this out. Maybe they get some desalination plants a lot more up and running, and they're able to be a little more sustainable on their water usage. I don't know. But this guy's has been buying massive amounts of real estate in the Midwest, specifically in Ohio, because his entire thesis is eventually these water shortages in the West are going to make people move, and they're going to be leaving cities like Palm Springs and Los Angeles and Las Vegas, and they're going to be moving into areas with far more water. All right, Robert, thanks for that. Let's go ahead and move on here. And let's just very briefly talk about this BRICS summit that's coming up next month. I think it's the 6th and 7th of July. And Russian President Vladimir Putin will not be attending this BRICS summit. It's in Brazil due to this outstanding international criminal court arrest warrant from 2023. Kremlin aide said yesterday, quote, "The Brazilian government could not take a clear position that would allow our president to participate in this meeting." So Putin will appear virtually at this BRICS summit, just like he did for the 2023 summit in South Africa, which he also missed for the same reason, this outstanding arrest warrant. And Putin did, however, travel to Mongolia for a BRICS meeting. I think it was last year. Mongolia is a signatory to the ICC, but they did not threaten to arrest him. They said they weren't going to. Unlike Mongolia, Brazil is a core member of the BRICS Economic Alliance. And I look at this and see Brazil's refusal to ignore this ICC arrest warrant for its economic alliance partner, Russia, shows the limitations that even BRICS members have in circumventing international law. And I just look at this and I say, BRICS is, I will not say that BRICS is exactly a paper tiger, but BRICS is nowhere, that BRICS alliance is nowhere near strong enough to just start ignoring an ICC arrest warrant. And on a long enough timeline, maybe they will. But BRICS Plus right now is not stronger than the Western-led international order, even though that Western-led international order is, I would say, deteriorating. BRICS is not there yet. And with that, all right, let's go ahead. Jared, we got a lot of questions still to get to.
Yep.
Briefly, go ahead.
Okay, so this is coming from the Israeli defense minister and Mossad. He said that they were as a joint operation, they are now designating the Central Bank of Iran, several other banks, and an energy company as terrorist organizations and terror operatives for their executives. He also promised strikes and to basically attack Iran anywhere that it has terror organizations. So that's a de facto promise to attack the Iranian central bank here. Now, these actions are particularly concerning for the long-term success of the ceasefire that was announced earlier this week, especially in light of the in-focus that you provided yesterday, where there's a general sentiment that Mossad is never part of a ceasefire. And Mossad is already part of this. So this is a developing situation. I will continue to monitor and report it as a potential reignition of the conflict.
Mm. Yeah, I would say this conflict is not exactly reigniting. It's just taking a different form. But I think this is my key assumption since the beginning of this is that Israel does not want to mow the grass of this Iranian nuclear program, and that eventually they're going to regime change Iran. Sanctioning the Bank of Iran and trying to get other countries, obviously, to do this is going to be part of this conflict. But you go back on Monday, the IDF came out and said they struck a bunch of targets inside Iran. And this was, of course, prior to the ceasefire. But they hit the headquarters of the Basij, which is the paramilitary domestic security force in Iran. They hit the Thar Allah Command Center. They hit a bunch of command centers that are responsible for internal security and the defense of Tehran and the greater capital region. And there's like 5 or 6 things that they hit. And you look at every single item on that list, and it has to do with internal security or the defense of Tehran. Israel is obviously trying to set the stage. These should be seen as shaping operations to enable an internal rebellion or revolution or some sort of revolt, at least, that destabilizes the Iranian government. We're obviously headed there. All right. Thanks for that, Jared. Let's move on here. And you know what? Actually, Jared, let's cover this in tomorrow's briefing. Let's table this because we're already at an hour. And we do want to get through some of the questions here. And I imagine that's going to be a longer part of the briefing. All right. Could we all be possibly being played by 3 flavors of religious extremists desiring to bring some version of end times theology? I don't know. I mean, I don't think so. I don't want to get into this. So next question. If Trump used the pocket rescission process, what is the chance that it gets overturned in the courts? Can the courts overturn that, Robert?
I don't think so. At least Vought and the Trump administration seem to not think so because it's in the statute. I don't know about overturned. Challenge in the courts, definitely.
All right. If civil war breaks out in the USA as described, what happens to all the wealth in the country? So this would be probably one area where we would see pretty quickly capital controls because you do not want your money leaving the country. So yeah, I would expect that capital flight into safe haven assets, real assets, become. And listen, something like a civil war is not just going to happen. We're not just going to wake up one day and we're going to be, civil war's here. We are going to be able to see this period of acceleration, pressure that's building up in the system. Okay, these are accelerators of conflict before we get to a trigger point. The trigger point could come at any moment, but it's not going to trigger a civil war unless there is enough acceleration of violence, unless you basically prime the pump of organized political violence. So this is not something that we're going to be surprised by. We're all, especially here, I'll be tracking this day to day. I will tell you when I think acceleration of organized political violence is building. I think it's at a very low level. It's happening today, but nowhere near what's going to be required for something like this. So what happens to all the wealth in the country? Yeah, I'm sure people are already trying to move their money out of the country. You look at the price of gold. I mean, it's like doubled in the past year or so, roughly something like that. The latest gold price projections I've seen are now at $4,000. Excuse me, it hasn't doubled, but it could double. But it's gone, I mean, very rapidly from 2,000 up to 3,500 or whatever gold's at right now. Someone can Google that. But the latest projections I've seen are it's going to keep going to 4,000. So all this is to say, yes, wealth will be looking for safe havens wherever that is. Capital rotation before we get to this point. Do you think conditions for civil war in the U.S. happened as an intentional act, or is it just a natural outcome of political corruption? Well, at a very, very minimum, it's just a natural consequence of what's been happening. I think the specific policies were, and I guess maybe it depends on what the policy is. Talking about Germany, this is something that former German Chancellor Angela Merkel talked about. They said they've got a massive demographic inversion. They need more taxpayers. They need more people paying into the system to support their basically social welfare state. And so Merkel said, well, yeah, sure, let's bring a bunch of Middle Easterners and North Africans and Sub-Saharan Africans into Germany, and they'll just become German like Franz and Hans. And that just simply has not happened. And Angela Merkel came out several years ago, many years ago, and said, yeah, this was a disaster. Multiculturalism doesn't work. And yet you have seen many other Western European countries continue down that same path. You've seen the United States continue down that same path under the previous president, knowing full well the long-term consequences of that, and yet it still happened. So you can say that's obviously intentional or deliberate. I guess maybe it's a matter of opinion on whether what we experience are unintended consequences or intended consequences. But it still doesn't detract from reality, which is that's exactly what's happening. Any advice for church safety teams that struggle with normalcy bias? They have no idea of the danger we're in. I'd probably just show them clips from the news. Listen, here's the thing: we've dealt with this to a degree at my church as well. The likelihood that your church is going to be targeted is extremely low, but the likelihood that a church is going to be targeted is extremely high. So I would just say continue to share with them news articles about this happening at other churches across the country, and hopefully there will be an awakening moment before a catastrophe. But just as humans, typically we need to experience catastrophe before we wake up, unfortunately. So I would just say continue to inform and influence them. That's the biggest thing you can do. And point out, hey, a church that has a security team, the past couple church shootings I think we've seen domestically, at least this last one was taken care of in the parking lot. I don't even think the shooter made it indoors. So I would say share that with them and inform and influence. Great question, Ty. Is it inevitable that the urban population wins the civil war over the rural areas? If not, what can the rural areas do to win? Okay. So, and this is a great topic. I will summarize in saying, again, I think this is Randall Carlson, that said the best organized in terms of state breakdown, state collapse, civil war, low intensity conflict. The side that wins is usually the best organized, and the best organized is usually the group that has the highest social cohesion. So I think that is there may be exceptions, but I think that is the general rule from Randall Carlson. Excuse me, it's not Randall Carlson. It's Randy Collins. Excuse me, Randy Collins. Randall Carson's that's the hydrologist guy. This guy's name is Randall Collins. And again, the side that usually wins is the best organized, and the best organized is usually the one with the highest social cohesion. So I would say focus on ways that you can build social cohesion among your group or your tribe or whatever you have, where you are, your neighbors. I would also look at the stuff like Bowling Alone, which I forget the guy that wrote that book, but basically one of his findings was that heterogeneous areas with a lot of different types of people typically have lower social trust. Areas that are homogenous typically have higher social trust. I think that is a huge part of social cohesion. So I would say in general, before we even get into more advanced stuff, let's focus on the basics, which is it doesn't matter how much firepower or what the twist rate on your barrel is or whatever kind of radios or gear, whatever you're running. If you do not have local social cohesion, you're probably going to lose to a group that has higher social cohesion. So I would focus on building social cohesion where you are. I think that is the most practical thing that anyone can do because it is one of those base effects. You will probably not win if your group has social discohesion. You may not win if you have social cohesion, but you are at a much higher likelihood of being better off if you do have social cohesion. Next question. Has FBI ever removed the target from normal parents or preppers who speak? I imagine they have. Robert, this is definitely a you question.
I have not seen any explicit announcement, but I think that's been a big thing from Kash Patel and Dan Bongino. At least what they've said publicly is they've been working on reversing a lot of these Biden era policies that went after like the PTA meetings and Catholic churches.
Mm-hmm. Well, I haven't seen any videos of parents being arrested at PTA meetings, so maybe that policy has changed. I think, didn't they say that they're going to pivot away from white supremacist violence and pivot towards general something else? I don't know.
Yeah, there's been, I think the line of what Kash Patel and Dan Bongino have been putting out publicly, because Dan Bongino's he puts out a lot of updates on his social media. not a lot of specific details, but general ways that they're trying to move the FBI is away from that, targeting quote unquote like white supremacist domestic terrorism and going after more, actual like crime and foreign terrorism.
Anytime I don't have the stats in front of me, but anytime we bring up white supremacist violence, okay, it's like it's been all in previous years. It's been all over the news, congressional hearings, one after the other. How do we defeat the white supremacist violence threat? And you go back and you even look at the most liberal sources who look at the numbers. And I want to say it's like basically you look at like a 10-year picture of people who have been killed by white supremacists. And it does not even, it's like less than all the murders that happened in Chicago in like 1 month. I mean, it's just an insanely low number of people, despite the amount of attention it gets.
Yeah, what a major talking point from a lot of these NGOs that kind of feed that, or I think as we've come to find out, there was a very strong relationship between the federal agencies and these nonprofits and NGOs. What they've been saying is what they call it right-wing extremist violent activity or right-wing extremist terrorism. And a lot of the times what they do is they roll up Islamic terrorism and like just criminal activities from prison gangs, like the Aryan Brotherhood, which is a prison gang primarily engaged in criminal activity. And they'll just roll those all up into one number to then say, well, compared to left-wing, terrorism, this is a major threat because it's 10 times as likely for this to happen. But they're including things that just I think very obviously have a political motive in rolling all these different activities together to make this claim about right-wing extremist violence.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that, Robert. Last point, we'll move on. I did bring up the numbers here. Even the most liberal sources, the experts, claim that white racial extremists were responsible for 329 murders between 1994 and 2020. That's roughly 13 murders per year, which is not unsubstantial. But to put that into context, Chicago, one city, had over 770 murders in 2020 alone, and that's more than twice the number of homicides committed by white supremacists over the span of 26 years. So you've got 1 year, twice as many as what the other people do over 26 years. So an absolute, say, misplaced concern. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. And Jared, we're running way late on time here, but are there like maybe 2 or 3 other really good questions? We'll get to the rest tomorrow. Mike, does your finance bro have any recommendations for what countries to move to? I keep trying to talk my wife into moving to Denmark now that I've retired. Oof, I don't know anything about Denmark. It depends. I've also been thinking through this. I would say a lot of it depends on, well, let's just start with the basics. So first of all, you probably want a country that does not have a lot of exposure to the dollar, because the dollar is going to be, we know they're going to have to inflate the dollar. They got to monetize the debt. They're going to inflate the debt away. So that's going to get a lot more difficult if you flee to a country that does a lot of business with the United States, priced in dollars. So let's talk about this, or maybe do something else. I don't know anything about Denmark, but there was that, the everyday spy guy said he was going to like some central, like Slovakia or something like that. I would just say, look for here's another problem that I think, if your key assumption is that many countries are going to experience some sort of social upheaval, some countries will absolutely be insulated. But what's going to happen, this great reset, a lot of these countries are very highly in debt. They're going to go through something very similar. They're going to have it much worse off because they can't print money to pay their debt like the United States can, because their debt is denominated in dollars. Their debt is not denominated in their own currency. And so that's probably the first thing I would look at is what sort of fiscal and financial situation is that foreign country in. The other thing, and I'm even hearing this from people moving from California to Texas to Appalachia to other places. Once someone learns that you're from California, you're definitely not going to be one of them. And I imagine when a bunch of gringos start going to Latin America and there is some form of upheaval happening in Latin America, I imagine tribal dynamics will probably take over. So that would just be another concern of mine. And maybe it's unfounded in some countries. I don't know. I don't live down there. So I will have to we'll cover that question later. All right, Jared, any other good questions? Do you see people using things like Bitcoin to evade capital controls, or is that not realistic? Well, I would say that's realistic before capital controls are implemented. One of the things that they've been doing and presumably will have to do is control the off-ramps from the dollar system. The Trump administration is going really heavy into Bitcoin and really heavy into crypto assets. We're seeing legislation now that's very crypto friendly. We're seeing states now talk about having their own crypto sovereign fund or their own crypto reserve or whatever they call it. And so it probably depends where you are. But if you're trying to go from the dollar to Bitcoin or to anything else, your major hurdle is going to be getting out of dollars, because anytime what you're really doing when you buy Bitcoin is you're selling dollars to someone when you buy Bitcoin or whatever crypto asset you have. If you cannot sell dollars or if no one is buying dollars, you're going to have a major problem because they're spending their Bitcoin to buy your dollars. So if no one's willing to buy your dollars from you, then you obviously have a problem. Just briefly, those are some concerns that I have.
The rest are related to that question, so we can cut it off there.
To Bitcoin?
Yep.
Okay, let's just do all the Bitcoin questions since we're here. We'll do it live. On the topic of capital flight, central bank digital currencies / Bitcoin, will the government also confiscate this from various outlets? Do they have the perceived ability? Well, it depends where your Bitcoin is stored. If there is a law that passes, they've been talking about doing this for several years now, forcing you into a custodial account. So that would mean that you could own Bitcoin, but you would really just have a Bitcoin account at your bank. And I'm sure only some banks would be able to do this. If that happens, if you don't have your private keys to your wallet, just like your dollars, the dollars aren't yours. They could be frozen. They could be moved from your account. They could be confiscated, whatever. Same thing with your Bitcoin at a custodial account at a bank. It's going to work the same exact way. So that is one consideration that would allow a government or any entity to confiscate or freeze your coins if they're in a custodial account. Now, if you have a wallet, a private wallet where you control the keys, then it's much less likely that can be confiscated from you. It's not impossible, but someone would have to get your seed phrase or be able to log into your account, which again is not impossible, but that would be the way to do it. But otherwise, if you have your crypto assets, your tokens on a centralized exchange, then yes, it is extremely conceivable that a nation state hacking group could potentially find an exploit or compromise or, it's just like these centralized exchanges that we've seen. In one case, this one guy held the keys to like hundreds of millions of dollars of tokens on his platform, and he just left one day. He bounced. They don't know where this guy is. He's probably in Tahiti somewhere, but that is a huge risk if you hold your tokens on a centralized exchange, which I do not recommend doing. If you have it in your Coinbase account, same thing. That's just the government's going to be able to confiscate that. So it probably depends on where you hold it. Next question. Couldn't they freeze your ability to use the Bitcoin? Well, that depends on the protocol. So there has been talk about essentially sanctioning the dirty Bitcoins, where if you stole Bitcoin from a wallet, potentially, if they work that into the code, then yes, there's probably a way where they could prevent you from moving that Bitcoin or spending it. So that's a much better question for a crypto bro who's actually into the weeds of all this stuff. But yes, my understanding is that potentially, if they updated the code to sanction those dirty tokens, then yes, they may be able to do that. What debt to GDP ratio does Europe have? Well, what country in Europe? I'm sure it's a Google search away. I don't know their debt to GDP ratios off the top of my head. The United States is at 124. Japan's at like 265. Those are the only two ones that I've memorized.
All caught up.
All right, everyone. Thanks so much for the longest show I think we've ever done. We appreciate your support. Appreciate you watching. Listen, tomorrow I'll be back. I'll talk about those three scenarios, those three events where I could see it leading to organized political violence, like a textbook definition of a civil war. Otherwise, we're just going to be stuck with low intensity conflict, which again could be quite violent, could be very disruptive, but it would not progress to the level of what we consider a civil war. So with that, everyone, thanks so much for your support. We'll be back in your inbox tomorrow morning, back on the show starting at 08 Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front.